So I remember when I was growing up, we used to be babysat by my grandparents. So my mum and dad would be working on Sundays, so we'd go down to our grandparents and they'd look after us. And they went to church every Sunday, very religious, very, very faithful people that they were. And so we would go along with them. And so, we were very young, so we'd go to Sunday school and then join in the second service later on with them. And so, I had a bit of an upbringing with the Bible. I had a bit of an understanding of the Bible stories, and like all Sunday schools, it wasn't in-depth Bible studies. It was, here are the stories of Jesus or Moses or the key characters, David and Goliath, of course, being a famous one. So I heard all the stories, and I always enjoyed the stories about Jesus. I remember, the stories of the parables, and just the stories of Jesus's miracles and his birth, and all the stories that go along with that. But I never really read my Gospels. I never really read the Bible. In fact, it was a bit hard for me to do that. My the only Bible that I had was actually given to me by my grandparents for when I was 8, I think, and it was a King James version. So they were very old school, very traditional with their Bibles, and so my grandfather was a King James only kind of Christian. So he thought the only Bibles he could buy us were King James, and so we had these King James Bibles. Anyway, all that to say, I never really read it. I never really understood anything about it, in fact. So my only Bible learning, my only knowledge of Scripture came through the stories that my Sunday school teacher would tell me or that my grandparents would tell me. But the stories always stuck with me because they were good stories, and the parables were very memorable. Like we saw last week, the reason why Jesus spoke in parables the way that he did was that they're memorable stories, that even kids could understand them. Kids like myself and my sister, we could hear these stories and remember them quite easily. So we always had that sort of foundation of the stories. But, as I grew a bit older, we weren't going to Sunday school, we weren't getting babysat anymore, we drifted away from church and all of these things. And so for a long time, they just sort of lay dormant in the back of my mind as my life went off in different directions. Well, anyway, 19 years old, I come back to the faith. I'm saved, and this time I'm doing it for myself. This is my faith. I'm going to church because I want to go, and all of that. And so I realized that the very first thing I need to do now is to go back and read the Bible. And I remember my experience of reading the Bible was seeing all of these verses and stories for the first time. We used to do memory verses for my grandparents grandpa used to make us memorize verses, and we get $5 a week, which back in the 80s was pretty good money, and still pretty good money for a kid that age to get $5 a week. So that was, it was worth the effort. So I remember, and of course we'd only memorize them in the King James version, but I remember reading the Bible again, and particularly reading the Gospels again, and seeing these stories in context, actually seeing these stories for the first time, and just going, oh, that's where that came from. And it was all sort of coming back to me and all these great memories that I had. But anyway, as I was reading through the Gospels, you're reading through Matthew, and you go, this is a great story. I was really quite enjoying myself. It was a good, a really good story, and I was seeing all of these parables and anecdotes coming back through, and new ones that it's like, oh, I didn't know Jesus did that. Oh, wow, okay. And I'm learning about this Jesus character seemingly for the first time. And then I thought, this is great. So then I turned over to Mark, and I thought, okay, what's Mark going to be about? And I started reading and thinking, this feels very familiar. I wonder if my pages got stuck together. Maybe I was missing something that, just feels like exactly the same thing. Thought, okay, so I finished through Mark, and that's a bit shorter, so it didn't take me as long as my reading through Matthew. And then I get to Luke, and I thought, okay, maybe there's something new here, and start reading through Luke, and, there's a few different anecdotes, but it's the same story again. Like, what's going on here? This is all a bit funny. And then I got to John, and it's like, okay, here we go again. Is it just going to be the same thing? And then in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. Okay, that's different. Suddenly that started to look a bit different. Of course, you get to John 3:16, and that's the one part of John that I did know. And anyway, so all of that was coming back to me, but what really stood out to me when I actually read these things for the first time was that it just felt like I was reading the same story 3 times. And there were obviously some differences between the Gospels. Some had different stories to others, but in the overall, they really just felt like reading the same story. And it really sort of struck me like, what is going on with all of this? Why have they basically put the same 3 stories in the Bible? And like, what's the point? Like, why not do something different? Like, why not give us some new perspective on Jesus? So anyway, it was sort of one of those thoughts that I always had. And, as the years went by, I sort of came to realize what was going on here with these. And so I guess what brings us to today's topic, which is the three different gospels, or the structure of the gospels, and particularly why do they, at least Matthew, Mark, and Luke, why are they so similar? So what we got to last week, what we saw was that the Gospels themselves are a collection of stories. They're a collection of traditions. And the way that these traditions came into existence was that the disciples of Jesus, they sort of pretty much probably met straight away as soon as the resurrection occurred, as soon as the ascension took place. They recognized that, all right, the teacher's gone now, but we are the bearers of his legacy and we're the bearers of his teaching. And so we need to be the ones to preserve and to carry those on, which is what all students would do. The job of a student wasn't just to learn from the teacher, but was to be the recipient of the tradition and then to be the one to pass on that tradition to the next generations. And so it's imperative, really, that when you receive these traditions from your teacher, that you receive them faithfully as the teacher intended them, as the teacher said them, word for word. You need to memorize these things very accurately because you don't want to misrepresent your teacher and you don't want to misrepresent the school that you're a part of. This is a very important part of your identity, and so you need to make sure that you're faithful to that. And so there was a real concern with those disciples to make sure that they remembered these things very, very accurately, and then when they passed them on to other students, that those students also gave the same faithfulness to them and the same care and concern for them, and that anyone who was going to teach them, the authorized teachers, because this message was going to spread, it wasn't something that just the disciples could do. Others had to go on and teach this message. And so those people, the ones that were receiving this message, had to be trusted people who memorized it properly and were carrying it on faithfully as well. And so what happened then as a result of that was that these traditions were spread out through the Roman Empire. Everywhere that these Christians went, they took these traditions with them. And what we see happening is that small groups of these Christian communities were established in cities all over the Roman world. And these were communities established around these traditions. Again, like all philosophical schools of the time, it would be a teacher carrying on the traditions of their teacher and then passing on to the students. So that was all very, very standard MO of all of these schools. What the disciples were doing was absolutely par for the course for that time. And so there's no surprises there, but what it also reminds us is that what these disciples are doing is they're going to be faithful to what it is that they've learned. But as we saw last week, what was driving all of this was this urgency. Get this message out there to the ends of the earth as quickly as possible because Jesus is coming back any day. And that was the expectation. The whole first generation of Christians expected Jesus to return in their lifetimes. And so there was an urgency. They needed to hurry to get the message out. And they didn't have any thoughts of really writing this stuff down or keeping longer records of it because they were fully expecting that, again, Jesus, if he's coming back in their lifetime, then so long as we've got the disciples with us, as long as we've got the ones that were there with him, then we don't need to have written records of this. Now, there would have been, when they collected the traditions together, they would have had some sort of official collection written down of these, but there wouldn't have been a need to spread all of that around, in large part because most people can't read anyway. There's no point sending around scrolls of all of these traditions and saying, here, everyone have a copy. Most people couldn't read it. The way that you're learning this is actually through through memorization. Now, as a sort of side note, and we'll pick up this in another series, is that one of the unique features we find of the Christian community, certainly in the centuries that come after, is that there's a higher literacy rate because we have scripture, because we have these written traditions that certainly other religious groups don't have. And so there is a need for people to learn. And there was sort of a realization to teach people, how to read their Bibles, how to read their scriptures. But anyway, we'll come back to that. Only to say that they came to a point where they realized, okay, these disciples aren't going to be around forever. Jesus hasn't come back. We better actually start to collect these together and gather together some official endorsed records or what we come to call gospels that the future generations can have, which are going to be trustworthy sources that can be traced back to guys like Peter, John, James, the original founders of the community. So that becomes the new project. And so this sort of falls to the task of a couple of what we would call gospel authors from sort of different backgrounds and for different reasons. But what they all shared in common was that all of them were faithfully collecting together traditions that all could go back to that original church in Jerusalem. And that was the most important aspect of this. And that they were collecting together traditions from particular disciples who were actually there with Jesus in the first place. So these were straight from the horse's mouth traditions. Even though they're written by other people, they're written on behalf of people or in the tradition of people who were there with Jesus. That was one of the priorities of these coming together. So what we have to imagine when we talk about the gospel authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, these people are authors certainly in that they wrote down these accounts. They wrote down these records of Jesus's life, but they're not writing down their own original thoughts. They're not writing down their own original ideas or their own interpretations about Jesus, their own this is what Jesus means to me kind of thing. That's not what they're doing. What they are doing is putting pen to paper and actually writing down the traditions as they've been memorized. And so the people that first read these gospels who have sort of grown up with these traditions, they would recognize these stories. All they're doing is just seeing them in a written form. So that was what these, I guess, what we call authors are doing. The better way to describe them really is or are editors. In fact, one of the disciplines in biblical studies is what we call redaction criticism, which recognizes that someone like Mark, for instance, yes, he's an author in that he wrote down a gospel account, but he was more of an editor in that he was collecting together all of these traditions and stories and arranging them in a certain way to tell a story. So he's an author in that he's telling the story of Jesus and he's telling it in a certain way and highlighting certain aspects of Jesus's life, but he's doing it with traditions that weren't his own. He's doing with traditions that he's received and structuring them in such a way so as to tell a particular story. And so then what we also saw in a previous episode was that the genre of these documents, the genre of these gospels is what we call, biography, but in the Greek, bioi, literally lives. And this was a common genre. It was a very standard genre with its own rules and expectations that go along with that. And one of the priorities of an ancient biography is not chronology. It's not, okay, this happened and then the next month this happened and then, Jesus was born here and then he grew up here and then he did this and this and then the death came. Like obviously the birth and the death come at the beginning and end of the story, but what happens in between them in terms of Jesus' ministry are a bunch of stories, but there's no real sense of chronology. There's no real concern for, okay, so then in, June of the year 28 or whatever it was, this happened, and then in August, they didn't even use those names for the month, but you know what I mean. Like there wasn't this priority of this happened and this happened and this led into this. What they are is a collection of these anecdotes, but structured in such a way so as to highlight different elements of Jesus' life in this case, but as a standard practice in biography, take together the stories that show a person's bravery or show a person's virtue or whatever it is that you're trying to highlight in that person's life. You gather together the stories that represent that and you put them together in such a way so that the reader is sort of given this strong sense of what characterizes this person and really showing the reader why it is that we're writing about this person in the first place. You don't write a biography of somebody who's just a nobody. You write a biography of a great hero, somebody who's done an incredible thing, somebody who's a very meaningful, significant historical figure. Those are the people you write about. And so what you're going to stress and emphasize are the things that actually made them the famous person that they've come to be. So all these guys are doing is just working within these traditions, and that's a very standard way of doing or of storytelling that we find in many other examples in ancient texts. So then the question might be asked then, why are there four? Why, and particularly when you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are so similar, why have those four Gospels? And certainly why have three that are so alike? Well, actually, as you look more closely at them, you really see quite a distinct difference between them. And we're going to come to some of the different emphases between the Gospels and actually recognize that there really is a different stress and there's a different priority for each one. But I guess in some ways, when you think about it, when you're telling the story about the same person, of course, it is the same story told multiple times. What you're trying to do is to stress or highlight slightly different aspects of that person. Because when you think about any person, think about yourself. You have a different set of roles. You have a different set of priorities within the same life, and it's not that you're living a double life. It's just that you have different things that are going on, and they're all you, but they represent different aspects of you. So, in my own case, I'm a father. I'm a college lecturer. I'm a husband. I enjoy doing projects around the house, restoring a car. There's different elements to me that are all me, and you could tell my story a number of different times and emphasize the different things and still really come to the same story. I'm still in the same place at the same time in all of the different stories, but there's maybe just a slightly different emphasis in that. So what we get in the Gospels are a different emphases on who Jesus was, different elements of his life. And as well as that, written with a different audience in mind, 4 different authors, and as we're going to see, writing to 4 different audiences. And so you've got, Greek audiences and Jewish audiences and more broad audiences, philosophical audiences. You've got different audiences that these authors are writing to. And so they're going to, again, telling the same story, but emphasizing a different characteristic of Jesus that meets the needs or speaks more directly to that particular audience. So when you factor all of that in, what you realize actually is that these Gospels, though they're telling the same stories, are actually the way that they're emphasizing them or the way that they're removing small details from somebody else's account of the same story so as to highlight, again, a different characteristic of who Jesus is. So all of that just to say that when we do come to the Gospels, don't just read them, very blandly. Just read them. It's all telling the same thing. So, just read Matthew and you've got everything you need to know. Don't bother with Mark and Luke. Actually, no, that's not the point. What we've got to be asking is, what is each author trying to emphasize? What is each editor trying to stress? Or what characteristic of Jesus' life are they trying to draw out? And sort of zero in on that. Note if there's a particular agenda that an author has, and identify that and really start to see how that comes through and see how that's really told throughout the story. But anyway, all that to say that we've got 4 Gospels because we've got 4 different authors or editors who are looking at Jesus from different angles and trying to draw that part out of his story. Okay, so that should be pretty clear. That's I probably spent too much time explaining that. So then the question still becomes, why is Matthew, Mark, and Luke so similar? And particularly when you compare them to John, why is John so different? We'll come back to John next week, but why are these 3 Gospels so similar? Well, what we have in the scholarly realm, in the scholarly world, is this idea or this term called the Synoptic Gospels. Now, you might be familiar with that term. You may have come across it before, but we talk about Matthew, Mark, and Luke as being what we call Synoptic Gospels, which comes from the 2 Greek words syn, meaning with or together, and opsis, meaning view. So a shared view or viewed together. In other words, they have the same outlook. They sort of share the same perspective on Jesus, which is their similarity. They do really tell much of the same story with different emphases, but there's so much overlap that we sort of recognize this synoptic idea of this synoptic view of the 3 Gospels together, which tells us straight away, I mean, at a sort of, logically you can deduce that they've copied off each other, that they've drawn from each other. It's like the 3 of them have almost sort of sat down at a table together and looked at the same story and told basically the same story like they've been sitting in an exam with just some slight variation between each one. Now, of course, that's not the way it happened. They didn't all just sit down and collaborate their stories. They wrote at different times in different places, spread over a couple of decades. So it wasn't in that they just combined or collaborated on the same story. What scholars have sort of come to agree on is that Mark was the first of the Gospels to be written and that Matthew and Luke both drew on him. So the reason why we suggest is the reason why this is argued is because, well, Mark is the shortest gospel. Mark seems to be sort of the foundation of what we find in Matthew and Luke. And when we look closely at Matthew and Luke, we start to see other materials, other information being brought in that isn't in Mark. And so then if Mark was to come later, the more challenging question would be, why did Mark take so much out of his stuff? You could very much understand why somebody would take a shorter gospel and add material to it, given the preponderance of information that there would have been. Why would Mark take it out rather than add more in himself? So the fact that Mark is the shortest gospel would indicate to us that his was the first to be written. And then what Mark and Luke have done is to come along afterwards and take that as the basis of their story. So use the same sort of chronological order of events that Mark has laid out, but then add their own particular stories, add their own emphases. And so you think about examples like the Sermon on the Mount, for instance, that we find in Matthew. Matthew has obviously inserted that in, and the question would then be, well, why would Mark take that out if Mark came after Matthew? That would make no sense. And then what we also see is that Matthew and Luke also sort of edit and polish some of the features of Mark's gospel. We'll see what some of those are later. Only to say that it's very generally agreed without any sort of question or without any real debate, that Mark was the first gospel and that Luke and Matthew drew from him. And we'll see next week the reasons why that came to be. But what we find in Mark then is the first gospel. Now the question might be asked, well, then why doesn't Mark come first in the New Testament? Well, what we see later on, we can see this next week, but what Matthew's emphasis on Jesus as the continuation of the patriarchs, the Old Testament fathers, it's fitting that Matthew is a logical transition between the Old and the New Testament. So that's sort of the reasoning for him coming first. But realizing that Mark is our first gospel. That was the first one to actually be written, and then the others came afterwards. But then what we have also in Matthew and Luke is another set of sources that Matthew and Luke both draw from that Mark doesn't use. So if Mark is the primary material, and most of Mark appears in both Luke and Matthew, there's not a lot of Mark that they've taken out. What Matthew and Luke have brought to it, though, are the same stories from a source that isn't Mark, but is obviously a second source that was parallel to Mark that have informed Matthew and Luke's gospel that doesn't appear in Mark. I hope that's making sense. But what we sort of conclude then is that there was a sort of a second, next to Mark's gospel, there was kind of a second set of traditions, still all from the original church, all still proper traditions of Jesus that haven't been used in Mark, but seem to be sort of another shared set of traditions that turn up in Luke and Matthew. Now, why we would suggest that these are sort of a collected set of traditions like Mark's gospel is because both Matthew and Luke draw from the same stories, but they're writing in different times and in different places, and so they must have this same collection of stories next to Mark. So if you imagine they're sitting at their desk, Matthew and Luke, at different times in different places, and on their desk is Mark's gospel, and that's their primary one that they're going to draw from, and then as they're doing their own version, they've got this other document, which what scholars refer to as Q. Now, it's not some secret spy name. Q, the letter Q stands for quella, if you want to do the proper pronunciation. The word quella is a German word which means a source. It's a pretty simple word, but what it would have formed would have been sort of a secondary gospel or a secondary set of traditions that both Mark and Luke would have had access to. And so they would have had, again, picture on their desk, they would have had their copies of Mark and then a copy of Q. And a lot of scholars have spent many, many years now trying to reconstruct what this Gospel of Q would have looked like. And it would have been probably another sort of set of traditions that would have been available throughout the churches throughout the world. We just don't have any sort of copies of it anymore. So they would have had Q, but then in addition to both of those, Luke has stories that don't appear in Matthew and Mark, and then Matthew as well has his own stories that don't appear in Luke and Mark. Say Luke, for example, has the story of the prodigal son. Well, we don't see that in the other Gospels. That only appears in Luke. So what that would suggest then is that Luke and Matthew on their desks have a copy of Mark, they've got a copy of Q, and then they've got their own sets of traditions from their own particular branches of the faith or the branches of the school that have come down to them as well. Again, all of these stemming back to the original apostles, but what's come down to Luke and Matthew are kind of their other traditions as well that have been picked up by the teachers that have gone before them in this sort of transitional period or in this sort of transferal period. So then what emerges from that is these three Gospels, which are, again, the same because they all share Mark's basic framework, and then similar between Matthew and Luke because they have Q, and then the slighter variations, the uniqueness of those Gospels comes from these other traditions that have informed Luke and Matthew respectively. So that's why that at least explains some of the similarities, but at the same time also explains the differences. And as we take a closer look at them next week, we'll start to see what some of those the differences are, some of those variations between them. But what that means for us right now is that our priority is Mark. Mark is the beginning point. Mark is our first gospel, and as we see with the dating of Mark, is the earliest gospel. And so Mark kind of forms the basis then out of which everything else comes. And so it's worth us taking a few minutes just to explore what Mark's gospel is about, realizing that he becomes sort of the basis for everybody else. So when you pick up your Bibles and you open them up on your phone, you'll see Mark in big letters at the top, and the gospel according to Mark or the Gospel of Mark or whatever your particular Bible labels it as. But then when you get to the text itself, Mark 1:1, you don't, and from then to the very end, you don't see any mention of Mark's name. And that's true for Luke and Matthew and John. You don't see any mention of their names throughout the text. And that's perfectly normal. It's not that they're trying to be anonymous. They just don't mention themselves in the text. Like somebody writing a biography. When I wrote that biography of my grandfather, I didn't put my name in anywhere. You wouldn't, honestly, I don't think I even put my name really in it at all because it's not about me. It's his story. I'm just telling about him. People that read it know it's written by me, but the book's not about me. So there's no point putting my name on there. And so what we don't find in the text of Mark is the name, but we find it in the heading. Now, what that would have meant is that in the earliest manuscript copies that we have of Mark is that somewhere on the document you would have had the gospel according to Mark or the evangelion. We've talked about that word already, but literally the good news, the evangelion, the good news or the gospel according to Mark. Now, the fact that that would be said at all, the gospel according to Mark, would indicate that there are other gospels, in which we know they are. But what they all shared in common, what they all recognized in common, was that they were all telling the same story. Jesus is the gospel. He is the good news. He is the good story that we're trying to tell. And what we're doing is telling our versions of the story. We're telling that gospel according to our own accounts and according to our own variations. So that would have been on the original document. If you imagine that there would have been sort of maybe a title page or a page at the back that we just simply no longer have because we don't have the original manuscripts, but that name certainly would have been there. But even apart from that, we have evidence from the earliest church fathers who all acknowledge that Mark was the original author of this. And so in fact we have, I won't read the whole quote, but it's a quote from what we find in Eusebius, the church historian, which when you date it all back, actually dates to about the 80s AD. So even in the 80s AD, the John the Presbyter was sort of a key figure in the church at the time. He was acknowledging and saying in his own writings that we all know that this was the Gospel of Mark. And in fact, well, I'll read you this sort of one small section of it that sort of describes the basis of that. He says there, Mark became Peter's interpreter and wrote accurately all that he remembered, not indeed in order of the things said or done by the Lord, for he had not heard the Lord, nor had he followed him, but later on, and as I said, followed Peter and used to give teaching as necessity demand, but not making, as it were, an arrangement of the Lord's oracle, so that Mark did nothing wrong in thus writing down single points as Peter remembered them. So what he's saying here is that Mark, the recognized author of this particular gospel, was not writing down his own personal accounts, but actually writing down the accounts of Peter. So this is an important point to recognize, is that Mark wasn't one of the disciples. Obviously, he was only if he was alive, he was only a kid when Jesus was around, but he was associated with Peter. And so what effectively Mark is writing down is actually Peter's gospel. Mark is writing down the accounts and the traditions that he's learned from his teacher, who was Peter. And so really this is Peter's gospel. This is the authority for this comes from Peter himself, which would, as we're going to see later on, actually give some explanation perhaps as to why Mark's gospel gets used in the first place, because actually this is Peter's gospel. It's not Mark's at all. Mark has no authority. Mark's not some great, powerful figure in the church, but Peter clearly is. And so if this is Peter's gospel, then this is one we're going to take very seriously. We're going to use this as a basis for future teaching. So that would give something of an explanation. That's going to come back next week to make a bit more sense of Matthew and Luke, but only to say that Mark is the one who collected these stories together and then wrote them down. Now, we actually know a little bit about Mark and about his life. So we actually meet Mark in the year 46, and we first meet him in Acts chapter 12 as a young man. Now, Mark was the son of a lady by the name of Mary, who was a patroness of Peter. When Peter's released from prison in Jerusalem, he goes over to Mary's house and he stays with her there, and Mark is sort of a part of that family. So Mark is living or growing up in Jerusalem. John Mark, as he's known in Acts. And so he's the cousin of Barnabas. And so when they first come down to Jerusalem, when Barnabas brings Paul down to Jerusalem, they meet up with Mark there. And then when they leave, they take Mark with them, actually take him along as something of a student or something of an apprentice. And really what that work would have meant was that he was going to be a helper. So 47 AD, they take Mark along for this first journey. But what we find out very early on in the journey, within maybe the first few months, is that it's just getting too much for Mark. He for whatever reason, he's not hacking it. And so he leaves them and he goes back to Jerusalem. Now, Luke mentions that as a part of the story because it does come back later on to have implications, but only to say that it sort of introduces a younger Mark, who, well, as we find out, isn't as reliable. He doesn't seem to be, that trustworthy sort of a person, at least in Paul's mind. So a couple of years later, in 49 AD, we have Paul and Barnabas about to go off on their second journey, and it ends up in a huge argument because Barnabas wants to take John Mark along with them, and Paul says, hang on, you remember what he did last time? Like he bailed out on us. Like, why would we take this guy again? Now, again, we don't know why he left, but he just left, and that's what it all sort of came down to. And so Paul doesn't want to take him, Barnabas does, and so they split up. They have a huge falling out, and so as a result of that, Barnabas takes Mark with him off on his own journeys, and he kind of writes himself out of the narrative at that point. We don't really hear about Barnabas at all after that. And Paul goes on his way now with Silas, and really the rest is history at that point. And so that's really it. If that was all the story we had, we would imagine that Mark was given an opportunity, he blew it, Paul moved on to somebody else, Barnabas took Mark, and that was it. And we sort of never hear from any of them again. But really interestingly, what we find later on in Paul's letters is actually that Mark reappears in the story with Paul in prison in Rome, writing much later on. And so we actually find in Paul's greetings two mentions, both one in Colossians and one in Philippians, of Mark, along with Paul's other companions, guys like Luke, and now with Paul. So we don't know what happened. There's no details whatsoever as to what has occurred here. But clearly this same Mark there's been some sort of reconciliation with Paul. Paul's forgiven him, and then more than that, restored him back into the team. And so now Mark is one of the companions of Paul. But even more interestingly, we actually find still in Rome at around that same time that Mark is a companion of Peter. Now, how was he with both Paul and Peter? We don't know. Maybe he was helping both. Maybe at the time he was, obviously, if both Paul and Peter are in Rome in prison at the same time, or Peter's there shortly after, it would make sense for Mark to be in Rome. He's probably living in Rome by this stage, helping these guys. And so we actually find at the end of First Peter, again, reference to Mark. We'll read the passage. It says, "With the help of Silas, whom I regard as a faithful brother, I have written to you briefly, encouraging you and testifying that this is the true grace of God. Stand fast in it. She who is in Babylon," that's Rome. Babylon is just sort of the Jewish sort of nickname for Rome, "chosen together with you, sends you her greetings, and so does my son Mark." So here he is. Mark is in Rome. He's there with Peter. And as we find out, he's writing down Peter's account of Jesus' life. And so we end up with our earliest gospel as, again, the gospel of Peter. So there's other clues as well that can sort of indicate to us that this is, again, Peter's gospel. It's the fact that Peter is the center of the story. If you read Mark's gospel and then you sort of read into Matthew and into Luke, who drew from Mark, Peter is the center of the story. Now you can say, well, because Peter's the most important person, he was the first pope, he was the rock on which the church is going to be built and all of those things. That's true. But Mark could still have told the story from the point of view of John, the beloved. John, the one that Jesus loves more than anybody else. He could have picked any of the disciples to tell the story from. He could have told the story from the story of Judas, why Judas went bad the way that he did. Any of those disciples could have been the center of the story, but the fact that he chose Peter would indicate that, well, this is Peter's story. Again, not because Peter's some narcissist, he's like, oh, I'll just make the story all about me, but no, because that's how Peter saw it. Peter saw it from his point of view, and there were times where Peter was doing things with Jesus that the other disciples weren't seeing, and so you're going to hear that side of the story, because this is Peter's story. Peter's telling it from his perspective. So all of this is just lending credibility then to the authority of this text. Yes, Mark wrote it and he wasn't a disciple, but he was really the ghostwriter for one of the disciples. So really what we have to see through Mark's gospel then is the story of Peter. We have to see or hear Peter's voice coming through this story. Now, the gospel itself would have been written in Rome. During that time, Mark seems to have set up base in Rome. We don't know anything of the details, but it seems quite clear from some evidence here that clearly that was written in Rome itself. Apart from the fact that Mark is there in Rome with Peter at the time, we also actually have this one unusual little reference, one of the little clues that you may not actually have noticed otherwise, but it's an interesting little clue as to its source or its origin. So in Romans 16, Paul's writing to the Roman church. He's at the end of Romans 16:13, he says, greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother, who has been a mother to me too. So Paul's writing to the Romans, and there's some guy by the name of Rufus who is a central part of that church there. But then in Mark's gospel, in Mark 15, it talks about Simon of Cyrene. Now we know Simon of Cyrene, but listen to Mark's account. It says, a certain man from Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. So the other gospels will mention Simon, but they don't mention that he's the father of this guy by the name of Rufus, so this Alexander and Rufus. So why is it that only Mark mentions him? Well, very likely because Rufus was part of the Roman church. And so by writing from Rome, he's also sort of, given a shout out to this Rufus guy, who's the son of this really famous Simon of Cyrene, who was the guy that carried the cross. And hey, man, his son's right here, and really sort of just trying to draw attention to, I wouldn't say the celebrity factor, but at least give honor to somebody who was quite obviously an important part of that church, maybe one of the leaders of the church, in the fact that Paul greets Rufus and says, hey, gives him a shout out, calls him out of the crowd. Rufus is obviously an important player in that community. And so Mark is sort of giving him that same kudos. He's not just famous, as some leader there, but he's also the son of Simon of Cyrene. So a couple of little clues like that would suggest to us quite confidently that this is a gospel written from Rome. Now, if it wasn't, it doesn't change any of the details. It doesn't actually really matter that much, only that we just try to figure out as much as we can from the bits and pieces of evidence that we have. We would suggest that it was written from Rome. Perhaps the more pressing question then is the date. And this is the question we sort of raised at the very beginning of this series, was the dating of these Gospels. Because if they're written much, much later on, then that would raise some question about their reliability. But we're very, very confident, and very few people, in fact, anyone who would suggest otherwise is just being cynical. They're really not. They're not somebody. They're not a very serious voice on the issue. Anyone serious about the dating of these Gospels will all generally agree that the Gospel of Mark is written probably around 70 AD, thereabouts, which places it very, very close to the life of Jesus and certainly within the lifetime of the disciples, or in this case of Mark, if Peter had just been martyred a couple of years ago, within very close living memory of the guy who passed on these traditions. So we dated to around about 70. Now, a very important event took place in the year 70, which helps us to date the Gospel of Mark, and that was the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem. So this was a hugely pivotal moment in the story of Israel, and it's a story we'll come back to in another series, but this is a really pivotal turning point, and it was the story of the Romans coming in, destroying Jerusalem, and certainly destroying the temple. What we find in Mark's account is this long, drawn-out prophecy that Jesus gives in Mark 13. Pretty much the whole chapter is devoted to these sort of prophetic signs about the destruction of the temple. And what we speculate from that is the fact that, again, this appears in Mark, but it doesn't appear in Matthew and Luke. These are one of the stories that they don't bring into their Gospels. This is sort of unique to Mark. The reason why this is in there is probably because it's just about to happen, or it's only just recently happened. If it is sort of this prophetic warning from Jesus, then it still has resonance because. And given the tensions that are going on in Jerusalem at the time, it may be a reminder of, hey, don't forget what Jesus said about the destruction of this. This you could be on a path to this, or it's only just recently happened. So it's maybe in the last couple of years. It's still fresh in everybody's mind. I mean, the rubble's still lying around Jerusalem. The memories of it are still very fresh. And so by incorporating this story almost of a, hey, Jesus warned you, he told you, like you should have listened. So whatever the case was, the fact that Mark brings this into the story about an event that happened around this time would suggest that this is about the time of the dating. Now, Mark didn't put a date in the gospel. He didn't say, I'm writing this on this month and this year. He's just telling the story. But when you look at clues like that, you go, it must have been somewhere within that. And so the date range that they estimate is somewhere between 65 and 75, but generally 70 is the number that gets thrown out as the dating for it. But I said to you a moment ago that each of these Gospels does have their own unique flavor, their own unique characteristics. And Mark is certainly no exception to this. Mark is a very unique Gospel when you look at it closely. And one of the first things you notice when you read it is that it's very fast-paced. Mark just gets straight to the point. Mark is not a drawn-out, long-winded storyteller like some podcasters, but he just gets straight to the point and then, bang, 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 moves to the next point and works his way through the story as quickly as possible, and then it's over. And so what you see in Mark's Gospel is what you don't see is the genealogies that you have in Matthew and Luke. What you've got is John the Baptist turns up on the scene, he baptizes Jesus, and boom, Jesus is gone. He's straight into his ministry. No talk about his birth, none of these stories about his childhood. It's just straight to the point of, here's Jesus, let's go. And even in the language itself, one of the words that turns up, at least in the Greek, is the word hoti, or immediately. It's just almost every paragraph is begun with this word immediately, and immediately this, and immediately this, and immediately, and it's just this quick, all right, we're done with that, move on to the next thing, and this had this impact on this, and this, and this, and this, and this, all the way through. So 42 times this word turns up throughout this gospel, compared to Matthew, which uses it 6 times, and Luke, which only uses it 3 times. So in other words, would suggest to us that what Matthew and Luke have done with the gospels is to take out the immediately. They're just trying to slow the story down a little bit, draw out some more of the details, and not just hurry their readers through. Come on, get to the point. Mark is straight to the point. Mark just wants this story to be told. And the feeling you get from that, you have to imagine when you're reading these gospels, you have to imagine them being read out to you. These Gospels weren't sat down and quietly meditated on. People were reading these out. And so there would have been a pace to it. There would have been a sense of urgency in the reading that would have conveyed Mark's desire for this to get this story told, and to really give this sense of something is changing and it's happening quickly, which is the story of Jesus' life. Jesus enters into the human story and everything changes. It's just like an overnight change. The world will never look the same again because of this couple of years of Jesus' ministry. And that's what Mark's trying to convey throughout the story. But what it's also trying to do is to sort of tell the story of Jesus in something of an apocalyptic manner. Now, we think about apocalyptic as, crazy end times sort of stuff. Now, apocalyptic, the Greek word apocalypsis, just simply means revealing. It just means that something is unveiled. The cover's been taken off and we can see what's really going on. That's the word, revelation. The whole idea of that is to take off the facade of this life and see the spiritual realm behind it. So it's just a revelation. It's a revealing of what's going on behind the scenes. What Mark is trying to do is to gradually reveal and unveil this story as he's sort of going along. And you think about, a good novel will start off with just some innocent character with an innocuous little thing. And as they start to unpick it, this huge story starts to unravel. And, as you sort of going along the journey, now the author knows the story. The author knows where this is going. They've already got the story in their minds. But you're going along with the character, new revelations appear, and every chapter is this new element of the story gets released. And you go, wow, and it keeps you engaged. Like, what's next? What's next? Well, this is what Mark is trying to do with his story. It's a bit like, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Beautiful Mind, that movie about Russell Crowe, who's Howard Nash, I think it's the character he's playing. Anyway, he's playing a genius mathematician, a college lecturer, genius, sort of guy. And as the story's going through, there's two characters alongside him all the way through. These sort of key characters, an older guy and a young girl, and they're sort of they're like best friends, and they're sort of working with him the whole way through, and he's always in conversation with them. And you get to the end of the movie, and you realise actually these characters are just in his imagination. And you're so convinced all the way through the story that actually these are real characters. But then you get to the end, and it's just this. What the heck? Like this mind explosion that these guys were never real all along. They were just, he's actually schizophrenic, and that these guys were never real. And then when you go back and watch the movie again, you actually see that there's all these little clues along the way. I remember this one in particular. Sorry, I'm going off on a tangent here, but there's this really great scene where he's sitting in a park and the little girl's running around, and she's running through a flock of pigeons, and they're all sort of pecking and they're on the ground. Now, of course, normally when you run into a group of pigeons, they all fly away, but she runs through the pigeons and nothing happens. The pigeons don't fly away. You go, oh, it was there all along. And the clues were in the movie, but you weren't looking for them. You didn't notice them until you get to the end, this big reveal, and you go, oh, there it is. That's the point. And so now the rest of the movie makes sense. All these clues that you missed the first time, there they are. And so Mark's kind of writing a story like that. He doesn't want you to know just yet that Jesus is the Son of God. He gives you clues. Now, it's impossible for us to see this because we know the story so well and we know how the story ends. But you've got to imagine trying to read Mark for the first time. You've never heard anything about Jesus, and you're going along, and then you get to the end and this great teacher gets crucified, and then all of a sudden you realize this is the Son of God. This is not what I expected. And then you actually go back through the story and you recognize, oh, the clues were always there. I just missed them along the way. And so, Mark chapter 1, you've got Jesus being baptized and this sort of voice from the heavens saying, you're my son, whom I love. I mean, it's kind of an obvious clue there, but, it's kind of we're not making, what are we really saying here? Is this really the one? It's sort of, there's a clue there, but Jesus himself isn't sort of declaring that. And then right at the halfway point of the story, in Mark chapter 8, you've got the confession of Peter. Jesus saying, who do people say that I am? And Peter's response is to say, you're the Messiah. And just like, all right, cool, just don't say anything else about it. Then there's the transfiguration we read in Mark chapter 9. And he sort of, reveals this revelatory moment to the disciples, but again, the world hasn't seen that yet. It's just something done in secret. It's something done sort of behind the scenes. And so we sort of get a clue, but it's not really properly revealed yet. And then even at the end of the story, Caiaphas at his trial says, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? Jesus says, I am, but you're going to see the Son of Man coming on these clouds. Like, it's not me. It's like I'm referring back to Daniel. Are you implying that that's you? Like, it's not clear. It's not explicit at this point yet. And then even all the way through, you've got this messianic secret. This, okay, you're kind of onto something, but don't say a word about it. Don't tell anybody about this. Like, why the secrecy? Why not tell the world, here I am, I'm here now? But what we find out as we sort of read closely, we realize that what Jesus is trying to do is like giving you some clues. The story is giving you some clues that this is the one, but don't rush off with it yet because the story is not finished. If you just think that I'm the Son of Man or the Son of God because of the miracles, that's all you're going to see in me. Or if it's in the healings or whatever it is, that's all the great teachings, that's all you're going to see in me. But that's not the story. That's not where the strength is. That's not what is going to make me the fullness of what I am or the savior that I'm going to be. That comes later on at the cross. And so the way that this story unfolds, you think maybe this is the one. Then he gets crucified and you go, oh, that's not how it's supposed to end. God doesn't get crucified. That's not how this story is supposed to happen. The main character is not supposed to die. Yet here he is, not just dying, but dying a criminal's death, dying a slave's death. What is going on here? But then you get the big reveal right at the end in chapter 15. So there's Jesus. He's now dead. He's been crucified and they're sort of reeling from the loss. And it says the curtain temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. And so there's an important significance of not just this revelation, but who gets the revelation first. It's the Roman centurion. It's the one doing the crucifixion, the one who is loyal to the emperor, the one who is loyal to the true Son of God, the Emperor Tiberius. No, actually, this loyal guard, this loyal soldier to Rome is now recognizing, actually, no, the true Son of God, the true Savior, Messiah, is actually this Jewish teacher that's lying dead before me. And so it's this Roman soldier that gets the revelation, but that's the big reveal. And what that message is saying, not just first to the Jewish people that this is the Messiah that's been promised, but now it's saying to the whole world through the mouth of this Roman soldier, actually, this is the new Caesar. This is the true king of the world. He has now come and, well, what happens next? Well, obviously the resurrection and we know how the story ends. But the point in all of this is that you're not supposed to know that till the end. Don't see Jesus as just the great teacher or the great healer or the great prophet. No, Jesus is the crucified Messiah. That's the point. And once that's happened in the story, now the big reveal comes because this is how you have to see him. Don't just see him as all these things that lead up to this. You have to see it in the context of the cross because in the cross, God is revealing himself. In the cross, God is bringing about victory. In the cross, God is overcoming the pseudo king of the world and revealing now to the world, to the universe, who the true king of the world is. And that is, of course, Jesus Christ, the hero of the story. So this is Mark's point. This is what Mark is trying to highlight, trying to draw out in his particular, the gospel according to Mark. This is the story that he wants his readers to come away with. And so that becomes the basis. That's that element of Jesus, that primary element that he is the king of the world, that he is God's son sent into the world to bring victory over death. That is the core of the story of Jesus. But there are other dimensions about Jesus as well. There's an element of Jesus that speaks to the Jewish world. There's an element that speaks to the Greek world. There's an element that speaks to the philosophical world. And what the other authors are going to do is they're going to draw out those elements. And when we put all these stories together, we get this whole picture of the completeness of Jesus and everything that he's offering to the world. And then, of course, to us as well as his followers. But that, of course, is a story for next week. So thank you for being here. Join me again next week and our final episode for this series. And we're going to look at the other three gospels and how all of that completes the story of Jesus. Otherwise, have a great week and I'll see you then.